Today we're going to learn about participles. Let's see what participles are. First of all, a participle is a verbal adjective. That means two things. It is both a verb, that is, it comes from verbs, and it's an adjective, so it modifies nouns and pronouns. In English, participles tend to be those words that we associate with ing or ed. So the singing nun, for example, is an example of a participle, or the beloved child. You can see that these words are adjectives because they modify a noun. Which nun? Nun, the singing nun. Which child? The beloved child. But you can also tell singing, loved, those are words that we would typically associate with a verb. And so that's what a participle is. It's part verb, part adjective. Sometimes these participles in English show up in something that's more than just an adjective. It is a descriptive phrase. So it's still acting like an adjective, but because it's got a verb as part of it, we can add more things to it. So we could say something like, he chased the dog running for its life. So which dog is it? It's the running dog, but then we add this part on, for its life. Or she tended the garden. Which garden? The garden planted by her sisters. So again, an ing word or an ed word, but we can add more things to it because it is also a verb as well as being an adjective. It's a verbal adjective. So participles are special because of this, because they are part verb and part adjective. And that means in Latin a couple of things that are really important for us to keep in mind. First, because they are adjectives, they behave like adjectives. So they have case, they have number, and they have gender, just like any other adjective that you know, like bonus aum. And they also modify nouns, just like any other adjective will do. But because they have this verbal aspect, because they are created or formed from verbs, they also have tense and voice. So they can be active or passive, that's voice, or they can be present or perfect or future tense. And because they are verbs, they can also take a direct object or an indirect object, an ablative of personal agent. They can be followed by a preposition, right? All kinds of things just like other verbs because they have this verbal aspect to them as well. And just like any other adjective, it can stand in for a noun, right? So just as we have seen other adjectives, we could, especially in Latin, right? If I said someone was bonus, right, you would know that means the good man. In the same way, we can use verbal adjectives, participles, as a noun. And we'll look at that more in just a minute. So Latin has only 3 participles. English actually has, in some ways, a lot of participles, or in some ways, very few participles, depending on how you look at it. But Latin only has 3 distinct forms: a present, a future, and a perfect. But 2 active and 1 passive, which means that there are gaps that Latin has in terms of its participles. There's just some participles that Latin doesn't have, and so that means there are things that Latin can't say. But we're going to focus on what Latin can say. So what Latin can do is it has a present active participle. So it's present tense, it's formed from the present stem, and it's active, and it is a participle that ends in ing. So we would translate it as loving, for example, in English. There's also a future active participle. So again, active voice in the future. and it means being about to love, which seems a little awkward in English, but I hope to show you what the future active participle will do. And then we have a past participle, a perfect participle. It is passive, and so here you can see the ed part, but it is having been loved, not having loved. That would be a perfect active participle, and Latin doesn't have that. Having been loved, perfect passive participle. And that's it. That's all that Latin has. So we're going to use these participles to the best of our ability. How do we form the present participle? The present participle is in some ways the easiest to translate because it's just that ing, remember. But it is maybe the trickiest of the three to form. You can see that because it's a present participle, it's formed from the present stem. So we are really going to use our infinitives. And in particular, we're going to pay attention to these vowels that we see in the first, second, third, and fourth declension or conjugations of our verbs. So amo, amare, it has a characteristic a, so it's going to be amans, amantis. If you remember when you learned third declension adjectives, you've learned adjectives like this, like potens, which means powerful, potentis. And that is really just a present active participle. And so these participles work exactly like potens, potentis. So in some sense, we are learning absolutely nothing new here. We're just learning how to do this for each of the conjugations. So amans, amantis, you can see for a second conjugation, moneo, monere, monens, monentis. Third conjugation, mito, mitere, mitens, mitentis. Fourth, audio, audire, audiens, audientis. Notice that it has the E as well as the I. And of course, because third IOs are really in many ways like fourth, it's going to be capiens, capientis. So you can see that it really is, in almost every way, pretty straightforward. And we're going to look at the full declension in just a minute. I just wanted to point out that deponent verbs, although deponents are passive in form, active in meaning, deponent verbs do have present active participles. And again, what we really need to do is identify what conjugation they belong to. Miror has that a, mirari, so it's first. And so it's going to look like amans, mirans, mirantis. Loquor, loqui, you can tell from the infinitive is third, so it'll look like mito. Loquens, loquentis. Okay, so just as we do for other verb tenses, for example, when we conjugate the imperfect, we need to know what vowel to use. The same is true with present participles. Amans, monanes, mitanes, audiens, capiens. Okay, let's look though at the full conjugation. So here we have an example. We have amans in the masculine and feminine form, just like you would have for potens, and in the neuter. And you can see that this declines just as you would expect it would for any third declension adjective of this type, of the type of potens. And you can see that it is essentially an I stem. So we have amanti, and we also have this alternate form amante in the ablative. And you can see that we have amantia, amantium in the genitive plural, amantibus, right, in the dative and ablative plural. So amans, amantis, amanti, amantem in the masculine and feminine, or amans, right, because the nominative and accusative are always the same in the neuter. Amanti or amante. We'll talk a little bit later about why we need these two forms. Amantes, amantia. And then these, of course, are the same and then amantes, amantia as well in the accusative. So pretty straightforward, not too crazy. I don't think this is really information you already know. And this would be translated, all of these forms, of course, would be translated loving. So how do we form the future participle? Remember, this is the one that means about to be whatever. And here, all we're going to do is take our fourth principal part. So for the verbs we've already looked at, amatus, monitus, missus, auditus, captus. And you can see what we're essentially going to do is add in there. So amatus becomes amaturus, monitus becomes moniturus, missus becomes missurus, auditus auditurus, captus capturus. So that's it. And you can see that these have masculine, feminine, and neuter forms, that they are of the type bonus right? So that first and second declension type, and they appear in singular and plural forms, masculine, feminine, neuter forms, right? They are absolutely and completely regular in every way. Amatoros would mean about to be loved, right? Monitus, about to be warned. Missurus, about to be sent. Auditurus, about to be heard. Capturus, about to be captured. Right? But absolutely regular, all of them, and super easy to form. And if you thought that was easy, let's take a look at the next one. The perfect passive participle is just the fourth principal part. It could not be more simple. So amatus becomes amatus aum, monitus, monitus aum, etc. Right? And again, these are of that type bonus aum, irregular, first, second declension adjective. You can do this in your sleep, and these will mean having been blanked, right? So having been loved, having been warned, having been sent, having been heard, having been captured. So that's how we form them. So forming participles is really not hard. As you can see, the present participle is maybe the slightly trickier than the rest. The future active and the perfect passive couldn't be easier. Okay, so now we know how to form them. How do we use them? So let's look at that for a minute. Oh, I forgot. We do have, of course, some verbs that have irregular participles. And that is, for the most part, they don't have all their participles, or they have participles that look slightly strange. So pharaoh, of course, is weird in all kinds of ways, and ferens is normal, but latus is our perfect passive participle, our fourth principal part, and so the future one will be laturus because it is built from this. Sum only has a future active participle, futurus, about to be. Ao has two. It has a present and a future, but you can see that it has this eanes and then euntis, and all the other forms are built from this. So it's going to be eunti, euntem, etc. You only see the I in this form. So that's something to keep in mind. Iturus is the future, and there just is no perfect passive. Volo and nolo only have present ones, and fio has the present, but it also has this factus, because it really is in some ways related to facio. So it shares a perfect passive participle with that. And we'll talk more about that as we translate sentences. We'll see how that works. So translating participles is really the part where participles get tricky. Forming them, as you can see, is really super easy. Now, the easiest kind of participle is when it's just an adjective. And here you can see I have a couple of examples. And here, Julia est amans amica, right? Julia is a amans, modifying amica, is a loving friend, right? So amica is nominative, singular, feminine, and so amans is also nominative, singular, feminine. They agree. In the second sentence, canem latrantem vidimus. So here's our verb, vidimus. We saw. What did we see? A canem. We saw a dog, latrantem, barking. We saw a barking dog. We saw a dog barking. But there you can see it's just an adjective. It's modifying canem. They're both masculine, singular, accusative. You can even see in this case, right, that the endings match. They both end in M. So that's pretty straightforward. They're acting just as any other kind of adjective. Slightly trickier is when we have those kinds of participles that have something extra built onto them. And that's when they can be tricky. They're almost like a clause, and so context can help. In your sentences, of course, you don't have much context, but we'll practice with instances where they do. You can see here's our verb, dixi. And so dixi is I spoke. Now, feminae could be genitive or it could be dative. Here it's dative singular. And you can see ducenti is also dative singular. It's modifying feminae. Remember we have those forms that are in the ablative that are either I or E. And so it's possible that this could be an ablative, but since it's also, the I is also a dative ending, here it probably is. The E is used for, in the ablative, is used for a special construction that we'll talk about next time. So for right now, you know that I could be either one, but since we've got a dative, these are probably agreeing. And then we've got this canem, which is accusative, and we have to figure out what to do with that. So I spoke feminae to the woman. And what kind of woman is she? She's leading. And what is she leading? A dog. Right, so in this case, dog is actually the direct object of ducenti, not of dixi. And we know this because what we have here is a sandwich. So you can see that feminae is on one side, ducenti is on one side, and then canem is in the middle. That is our cheese or our hummus or whatever you want to put in your sandwich. And these are our pieces of bread. So I spoke to the woman. Which woman? Leading the dog. And we could say this clause in a slightly different way, right? We could say, I spoke to the woman who was leading the dog. I spoke to a woman when she was leading a dog. I spoke to the woman since she was leading a dog. All of these are possible translations. The important thing is that, of course, the leading modifies the femina, but depending on the context, we might translate the sentence in a variety of ways. We can see something similar in the next example. Video is our verb. I see. What do I see? Something in the accusative, I hope. And look, we have right here Marcum in the accusative. We have populis, which is either dative or ablative. We don't know yet. And we have locutorum, also accusative. So again, likely that this is modifying this. And then we've got this thing in the middle. Again, looks like we have a sandwich, right? With this, and then something in the middle. So what are we going to do? I see Marcus. And what is Marcus doing? Locutorum. Being about to speak. And then dative or ablative, to the people, by the people, probably to the people. I see Marcus being about to speak to the people. I see Marcus when he is about to speak to the people. I see Marcus who is about to speak to the people. Something like that. So you can see we can always use the participles very literally, and that will absolutely work. But you can also play around with them a little bit, using words like when, since, although, or treating them really like a relative clause. And that can work too. Finally, we do have instances, as I said before, where we can just translate the participles as a noun in the same way that we do with adjectives. And these are always the trickiest. These are tricky for everyone, I think. But we could say something like illa amantem delewit, right? So we would say that woman, illa, delewit, there's our verb, destroyed. And what did she destroy? Amantem. There's our accusative. So she destroyed a loving person. She destroyed her lover. Right? Now you could of course say she destroyed a loving man or woman, and that would be okay. You could absolutely put that in there. But you can also change it slightly, right, so that it makes more sense maybe. That woman destroyed her lover. Likewise, you can see an example here with monito. Dedi, I gave, right? And this is a kind of verb that likes to take a direct object and an indirect object. So that's what we should be looking for. I gave, here's our direct object in the accusative. I gave a letter, so this is probably dative, to the warned person, right? That is, I gave the letter to the person who had been warned, or the person I had warned, or anything like that, right? And again, context will help. So that is really how participles are used. Let's review a little bit. First of all, participles are verbal adjectives. They are formed from verbs, as you've seen. We used different principal parts to form them, the second principal part or the fourth. But they're adjectives too. That is, they modify nouns and have case number and gender just like all other adjectives do. Latin has 3 and only 3 participles: a present active participle, a future active participle, and a perfect passive participle. The present active, remember, is the one that ends in -ns. The future ends in urus, and the perfect passive participle is the same as your fourth principal part. The present participle declines like an I stem. The future and perfect are like a first and second declension. And remember, there are 3 different ways that we can translate them. Sometimes they're just regular old adjectives. That's the best. Sometimes they have additional information in there, a direct object or an indirect object maybe, and sometimes we want to translate those more like a clause. We might want to use when or since or if or because, or translate it like a relative clause. And then remember, also sometimes they can be used like a noun, and those are maybe the trickiest. Okay? We're going to get a lot of opportunities to practice with these. So don't forget to send me up to 3 questions by 9 a.m.